Eddie Van Halen walked into the backstage area at Madison Square Garden in 1978 and pointed at Ace Frehley's guitar. "Let's have some fun," he said to the band members standing around. "Let's see if the Space Ace can play without all that smoke and makeup. See what happens when a costume rocker tries real guitar work." Everyone thought it was hilarious. Ace, leaning against the wall with his silver Les Paul, just smiled behind that iconic makeup. "Sure, Eddie. Pick a song." Then Ace counted off a tempo and played a guitar passage so technically complex, so emotionally powerful, that Eddie Van Halen's grin froze on his face. The sound engineer hit record on a portable tape machine, capturing what would remain one of rock music's best-kept secrets for over 30 years. But before we dive deeper into that night, make sure you subscribe to this channel because we're uncovering stories about rock legends that have never been told before. To understand what happened that night, you need to know who these two men were in 1978. Eddie Van Halen wasn't just a guitarist. He was revolutionizing the instrument. His debut album had dropped earlier that year, and Eruption had sent shockwaves through the guitar world. Two-handed tapping, harmonic squeals, dive bombs, techniques that made other guitarists question everything they knew. Eddie was 23 years old, cocky, brilliant, and he knew he was changing rock music forever. He had opinions about Kiss, and they weren't positive. He saw them as a spectacle band, more about makeup and pyrotechnics than actual musicianship. Four guys in costumes playing simple riffs for arena crowds who cared more about the show than the songs. Ace Frehley was the lead guitarist for the biggest rock band in the world. Kiss had sold millions of albums, filled stadiums across the planet, and created a cultural phenomenon that went far beyond music. But here's what most people didn't know, what the makeup and the Space Ace persona hid from view. Ace Frehley was a guitarist's guitarist. Before Kiss, before the silver paint and the smoking guitar, Ace had been Paul Daniel Frehley from the Bronx, a kid who'd spent thousands of hours mastering the instrument, studying blues legends, jazz fusion pioneers, and classical compositions. He'd developed a style that blended melodic sensibility with technical prowess, but Kiss's format didn't let him show his full range. The 3-minute rock anthems, the arena-friendly riffs, all of it meant that Ace's deeper abilities stayed hidden beneath the costume. It was June 1978, and both bands were at Madison Square Garden on consecutive nights. Eddie had come by early Saturday afternoon, curious to see Kiss's famous stage setup. That's when he spotted Ace in a hallway near the dressing rooms, already in full makeup even though the show was hours away. Ace was holding his custom Gibson Les Paul with the silver finish and DiMarzio pickups, the guitar that had become as iconic as the man himself. Eddie walked over, confident, maybe too confident. He'd been drinking Jack Daniels since noon. "Ace Frehley," Eddie said, extending his hand. "Eddie Van Halen, hell of a rig you guys have here." Ace shook his hand. "Eddie. Yeah, I heard your album. That tapping thing you do, that's something else." "Thanks, man." Eddie's grin got wider. "You know, I was just thinking, with all this gear, all these effects, all the smoke machines and the lights, it must be easy to sound good. Put any guitarist up there, and they'd probably sound like a hero, right?" The hallway went quiet. This wasn't friendly shop talk anymore. This was Eddie Van Halen openly suggesting that Ace's sound was more about production than skill. Ace looked at Eddie for a long moment, and something shifted behind that silver makeup. "You want to hear what it sounds like without the production?" Ace asked. "Just the guitar?" Eddie laughed. "Sure, Space Ace. Show me what you've got under all that costume." Ace walked over to a small practice amp in the corner, a beat-up Fender Princeton. He plugged in his Les Paul No effects, no pedals, no studio magic. Just a guitar and an amp. What do you want to hear? How about something in minor? Let's hear some real blues, not that arena rock stuff. What nobody in that hallway knew was that Ace had been studying guitar seriously since he was 13. Not just rock and roll, but jazz, blues, classical techniques. He'd taken lessons from Charlie Barnett in the Bronx, a session player who'd worked with jazz orchestras throughout the 50s and 60s. Charlie had taught Ace theory, complex chord voicings, modal playing, all the sophisticated elements that didn't fit into Kiss's radio-friendly format. Ace adjusted the controls on his Les Paul and started to play. What came out wasn't the pentatonic rock riffs that Kiss fans knew. It was a complex blues progression in B minor, the kind of playing you'd hear in a small jazz club at 3 in the morning. His fingers moved across the fretboard with precision, hitting notes that most rock guitarists never touched, using chord inversions and harmonic structures that required years of study to master. He played with dynamics, building from whisper-quiet passages to passionate crescendos, making that little Princeton amp cry and sing simultaneously. The smile disappeared from Eddie Van Halen's face. He stood there watching those fingers work, and his expression shifted from amused to shocked. This wasn't a costume rocker pretending. This was someone who knew the instrument fundamentally, who'd put in the work, who understood music theory. Ace played for about 3 minutes, exploring different melodic ideas, throwing in jazz-influenced runs borrowed from Wes Montgomery and Kenny Burrell, then transitioning into blues phrasing that would have made B.B. King nod with approval. He ended with a sustained note that he bent slowly, wringing every bit of emotion from it before letting it fade into silence. Nobody moved. The sound engineer who'd grabbed his portable recorder had captured the entire performance on tape. Eddie Van Halen walked slowly toward Ace. His swagger was gone. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Eddie asked, his voice completely changed. "From guys like Charlie Barnett in the Bronx," Ace said. "I studied jazz and blues for years before Kiss. I bought every Wes Montgomery album I could find. I'd sit in my room with a practice amp and play along, trying to figure out those chord voicings. I never stopped studying, even after we got famous. The makeup doesn't change what's in my fingers." Eddie stood there processing this. "You taught yourself jazz guitar by listening to Wes Montgomery records?" "Not just Wes. Kenny Burrell, Grant Green, even some Django Reinhardt. I wanted to understand where rock guitar came from." Eddie laughed, but it wasn't mocking anymore. It was genuine surprise. "Man, you can really play. Why don't you do this in Kiss? Why hide it?" Ace shrugged. "Paul and Gene have a vision for what Kiss should be. Arena rock, accessible, theatrical. There's not room for jazz fusion and rock and roll all night. The fans want the show. The guitar work I just did, that's for me, for other musicians." "That's insane," Eddie said. Then he turned to the sound engineer. "Tell me you got that on tape." The engineer nodded. "Got all of it." "Good. Because that's one of the most impressive pieces of guitar work I've heard from anyone." For the rest of that afternoon, Eddie stayed backstage, and the dynamic had completely transformed. They sat in Kiss's dressing room, trading licks, discussing technique. Eddie showed Ace some of his tapping innovations, and Ace demonstrated jazz voicings he'd learned from Charlie Barnett. It was a conversation between equals. Eddie would occasionally shake his head. "I came here thinking Kiss was just a circus act. I was wrong. You're the real deal. You're not just a guitarist in a costume. You're a musician who happens to wear a costume." Ace smiled. Eddie, I get it. From the outside, Kiss looks like it's all about the show. And it is, partly. But every one of us can really play. We just put it in a package that sells tickets. Eddie leaned back. Can I give you some advice, though? Sure. Don't hide this forever. You've got abilities that most guitarists would kill for. Find a way to let people hear this side of you. Maybe a solo album. But don't let this talent stay hidden just because it doesn't fit the Kiss image. Ace nodded, taking it seriously. This conversation planted a seed that would grow into reality later that year when Ace recorded his solo album, the one that would become the best-selling of all 4 Kiss members' releases. The tape of Ace playing that blues progression sat in a box of miscellaneous recordings for over 30 years. The sound engineer, Tom Mitchell, had kept it, but never knew what to do with it. He labeled it Ace Backstage June '78 and filed it away. The tape didn't surface until 2009 when Tom was digitizing his archive. He came across the recording, played it through his studio monitors, and sat there amazed. He'd almost forgotten how good Ace had been that day. Tom reached out to Ace's management. By this time, Ace had left Kiss, released solo albums, and was rebuilding his career after struggles with addiction. The tape arrived at the perfect moment, a reminder of who Ace had always been underneath the persona. When Ace heard it for the first time in 3 decades, he called Tom personally. Man, I forgot about that day. Eddie came by to bust my chops and ended up staying for hours. We became friends after that. He'd call me sometimes. We'd talk about guitar stuff. That conversation in the hallway started a real friendship. Ace decided to release it as a bonus track on a reissue of his 1978 solo album, connecting the hidden moment to when he'd finally shown his range publicly. When the tape was released in 2010, the reaction was immediate and intense. Publications that had treated Kiss as a cartoon band suddenly had to reconsider. Guitar magazines analyzed the recording, breaking down Ace's technique, his note choices, his harmonic sophistication. Professional session players recognized a skill level beyond what most rock guitarists possessed. Eddie Van Halen, when asked about the tape, just laughed. Yeah, I remember that day. I went to Madison Square Garden thinking I was going to school some makeup guys on real guitar playing. Instead, Ace gave me a lesson in humility. That recording doesn't even capture the whole conversation we had afterward. Ace showed me voicings I'd never seen. I came away understanding that you can't judge a musician by their image. Ace is one of the most underrated guitarists in rock history, partly because the Kiss presentation made people think it was all spectacle. The story became legendary among musicians. It represented something important about talent and perception. Ace Frehley wasn't just a guy in silver makeup. He was a musician who'd studied seriously, who understood his instrument theoretically, who'd developed skills that rarely made it onto Kiss records because they didn't fit the format. The irony was profound. Ace had spent years mastering techniques that most rock guitarists never touched, then joined a band that became famous for theatrical songs that didn't showcase those abilities. Musicians who heard the tape started asking what else Ace could do that audiences never witnessed. How many other abilities had he kept hidden because they didn't fit the Space Ace character? The question was about the price of fame. Ace had become one of rock's most recognizable faces, but he'd suppressed significant parts of his musical identity to maintain that status. The jazz player in him had to stay hidden because it might confuse the brand. Paul Stanley described walking past Ace's hotel room on tour and hearing him play acoustic guitar, working through complex patterns that had nothing to do with Kiss. Ace was always practicing stuff that would never make it onto our records. That dedication was admirable. Gene Simmons, often critical of Ace's later struggles, would still acknowledge his musicianship. When Ace was on, he could play circles around most guitarists. Pure guitar skill. Ace had it in abundance. The tape changed how a generation viewed Kiss. Younger guitarists who dismissed them as a novelty act started going back through Ace's catalog, listening more carefully, recognizing the sophistication that had always been there. Guitar instructors began using Ace's playing as examples, showing how he blended melody with technical skill. The story also showed a different side of Eddie Van Halen, a musician capable of recognizing talent even when it came in an unexpected package, someone who could admit he'd been wrong. More importantly, it highlighted a problem in rock criticism. Too often, critics judged musicians based on commercial presentation rather than actual abilities. Kiss's theatrical approach made it easy to dismiss them, but that dismissal was lazy, a failure to listen to what was actually happening musically. For Ace personally, the tension between his abilities and his public persona contributed to struggles that defined much of his career. Being the space ace was thrilling and suffocating simultaneously. It brought fame, but also created a prison of expectations. Fans wanted the character, not the complex human underneath. When Ace left Kiss in 1982, it was partly about creative frustration, the feeling he'd never fully express his musicianship within the band's format. His solo career became his outlet for musical explorations Kiss couldn't accommodate. But it revealed a double-edged sword. Many fans who bought Ace's solo albums wanted cold gin, not jazz-influenced passages. The space ace persona that made him famous had also limited what audiences expected. Breaking free proved nearly impossible. The battles with addiction Ace faced were intertwined with this identity conflict. In interviews during recovery, Ace talked about feeling lost between personalities, unsure whether he was Paul Daniel Frehley or Space Ace, or some uncomfortable hybrid. When the tape surfaced in 2009 and Ace released it, he was in a different place. He'd gotten sober, rebuilt relationships, and found peace with his legacy. The recording represented a moment when he'd been young, confident, still believing he could balance Kiss's demands with his deeper musical interests. Listening 3 decades later brought mixed emotions: pride in his playing, sadness about missed opportunities, appreciation for the path he'd walked. In interviews promoting the tape's release, Ace reflected on that day with Eddie. Eddie represented everything I wanted to be as a guitarist, someone known for pushing boundaries. Kiss was successful, incredibly successful, but I sometimes wondered what I could have been if I'd focused on musicianship instead of spectacle. That afternoon with Eddie reminded me that I did have those skills, that I wasn't just a cartoon character. It mattered that he recognized I could really play. Eddie maintained his respect for Ace throughout his life. In one of his final interviews before his death in 2020, Eddie mentioned guitarists who'd impressed him. He brought up Ace. People sleep on Ace Frehley. They see the Kiss makeup and assume it's all gimmick. But Ace had serious chops, real musicianship. That day I met him backstage. He played stuff that most rock guitarists couldn't touch. He just chose to put those abilities into a different package. That's a valid artistic decision. I respect it. The tape is now considered important rock history, not because it's Ace's best work, but because it reveals something true about talent, perception, and the compromises artists make for commercial success. It shows that musicians are more complex than their public images, that serious skills can exist even in bands dismissed as purely commercial, and that sometimes the most revealing performances are the ones nobody was supposed to hear. Eddie Van Halen came to Madison Square Garden that day to have fun at the expense of a makeup band. He left having witnessed something that challenged his assumptions about who deserved to be called a serious guitarist. That recording, hidden for 30 years, proved that talent doesn't always align with critical respect. But it's still there, in the fingers, in the musical knowledge, waiting to be discovered. The story resonates because it's about more than two guitarists meeting backstage. It's about the masks we all wear and what gets hidden when we commit to a public persona. Ace Frehley put on silver makeup and became the Space Ace, achieving fame beyond most musicians' dreams. But he also hid significant parts of his artistic identity, musical abilities that didn't fit the character. Was it worth it? That's a question only Ace can answer, and the answer likely changes daily. The success was real. The impact on rock culture was real. But so was the frustration, the feeling of untapped potential. Somewhere in a parallel universe, there's a version of Paul Daniel Frehley who never joined Kiss, who became a respected session guitarist exploring jazz fusion and blues, who never wore makeup. That version might have had a more artistically satisfying career, but would have affected far fewer people. The Ace Frehley we got, the one who chose the makeup and spectacle, reached millions and inspired countless kids to pick up guitars. The tape from that backstage encounter represents the bridge between these two possible lives, a moment when the hidden musician emerged briefly, and one of the greatest guitarists of the next generation was there to witness it. And if there's an afterlife for rock musicians, somewhere Eddie Van Halen is probably telling anyone who'll listen about the day he challenged Space Ace to play real guitar and learned not to judge a musician by their costume.